is I should be asleep, but I'm not. So we are going to watch this and fall asleep on history, since there's a lot of fighting over land and who is who and who's supposed to, who do it belong to. We're going to talk about who really discovered America. Since there's been a lot of whitewashing, we need to get some black lava, black gold, something to tell the truth and shame the devil. There's been a lot of whitewashing going on. You know, a lot of misleading facts. So that's go back, since there is a entitlement, a whole unnecessary disrespect of who who land is whose and who was here first and who is, you know, who came from who and all of that there. Yeah. Since they wanted to lie and say that pro-Israel was biblical about two brothers, and that's not the truth. So now we just finna undo a lot of lies. How about that? Is that okay? I hope it is, because we gonna do it anyway. We gonna tell the truth and shame the devil. You understand? We gonna tell the truth and shame the devil. Let's talk about Christopher Columbus. Did he lie and steal? Is this where the lying came from? Let's check it out.
Of Mansa Musa, one of the richest men to have ever lived, the king of Mali who lined his path to Mecca with gold and put his kingdom on the map, literally. But have you heard about the one who made him king? Before Mansa Musa, there was Mansa Abubakr II. He was Mansa Musa's brother and king of the Mali Empire. So how did Musa become king? On his legendary journey from Mali to Mecca, Mansa Musa crossed paths with Damascene historian Shihab al-Umari and told him how. The monarch who preceded me would not believe that it was impossible to discover the limits of the neighboring sea. He wished to know. He persisted in his plan. Mansa Abubakr II was an avid traveller and had roamed all around his vast empire before yearning to discover what lay beyond the Atlantic. So he called on engineers of the Lake Chad to build ships so he could launch a fleet across the ocean. He hired a crew of sailors, traders, builders, artists, warriors, and learned men, and supplied them with enough rations to last 2 years. He told them not to return until they reached the end of the ocean or until they had run out of food and water. But after a lone captain and only one of the ships from the 200 he had sent returned to Mali, claiming that the other ships had been pulled into a current and disappeared, Mansa Abubakr II began to prepare a fleet once more. But this time, the brave and adventurous king decided to make the journey himself in 1311, almost 200 years before Columbus set foot on American shores. Just as Mansa Musa's journey to Hajj was 11, almost 200 years before Columbus set foot on American shores. Just as Mansa Musa's journey to Hajj was legendary, so was his brother's journey across the Atlantic. A great leader, Mansa Abubakr II travelled with his men on 1,000 ships and sent a further 1,000 ships with supplies, trade materials, crops, and animals, and of course gold, which was abundant in his kingdom. So did Mansa Abubakr II arrive in the Americas? We may never know, but there are many signs that West African Muslims did. Some of the strongest evidence comes from the pen of Columbus himself, who wrote in his journal that Native Americans confirmed black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats, trading in gold-tipped spears. Not only were these spearheads described as guanine by Native Americans, which was the Mandinkan word for gold, the language of the Mali.
So Christopher Columbus knew himself that black people were here before him. So he came being a liar. Ooh, Lord, I see why Trump like him. Let's go.
So did Mansa Abubakr II arrive in the Americas? We may never know, but there are many signs that West African Muslims did. Some of the strongest evidence comes from the pen of Columbus himself, who wrote in his journal that Native Americans confirmed black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats, trading in gold-tipped spears. Not only were these spearheads described as guanine by Native Americans, which was the Mandinkan word for gold, the language of the Mali Empire, but chemical analysis of those spearheads found that the gold most likely originated from West Africa. Columbus and his son also found that Native Americans had handkerchiefs like those used in West Africa, and clothes similar to the Muslim Moors of Spain. Whether or not Mansa Abubakr II himself made it to the lands beyond the Atlantic, we cannot deny that this courageous ruler of one of the richest and largest empires on earth gave up wealth and power in pursuit of knowledge and discovery. His determination to reach the Americas could very well mean that West Africa's relationship with the Americas did not begin with slavery, but with sailors, explorers, and kings.
Okay. Let's keep going. We gonna start telling the truth and shaming the devil. That's what we gonna do. You understand? We must tell the truth and shame the devil. Folk have to know how how royal we really are. You understand? They have to know who was here from. Because sometimes I have to explain to my tea-sippers and the guests who fall up in here. They be talking all that crazy talk like they special, like they more special than black people, like they entitled. Sometimes I have to remind them that they came from us. We didn't come from them. You understand? Sometimes I have to remind the people. Listen with your good ear. Listen with your good ear, okay?
The second had already sailed. Your schools lied to you.
Sure did.
Your teachers lied to you.
Sure did.
Don't get mad at me for exposing the truth. But Columbus didn't discover America. A black king did.
They know
And
that.
before you start crying about it, give me 30 seconds to explain.
Yeah.
Almost 200 years before Columbus ever touched a boat, a West African ruler named Abu Bakr II had already sailed across the Atlantic. But I bet your
Already.
school left that part out, didn't they? This man wasn't some minor tribal leader. He was the emperor of the Mali Empire, one of the richest civilizations to ever exist. Gold ran through its veins like water. While Europe was fumbling through the Dark Ages, Mali was thriving, educated, sophisticated, and wealthy beyond imagination. Abu Bakr was a visionary. Imagine sitting on a golden throne, so bright it blinds your guests and still saying, I need to know what's beyond that ocean. He built a fleet so massive the horizon disappeared under his sails. Some say 200 ships, others say thousands. And
You hear that?
imagine sitting on a golden throne, so bright it blinds your guests and still saying, I need to know what's beyond that ocean. He built a fleet so massive the horizon disappeared under his sails. Some say 200 ships, others say thousands, and he didn't just send them, he led them. He passed his throne to his brother, Mansa Musa, the same man history calls the richest person to ever live, and set off to find what lay beyond the sea. Musa later told historians, "My brother did not return because he crossed the ocean." That one sentence rewrites everything we were taught. It means Africa wasn't waiting for Europe to discover it. Africa was already discovering the world. Indigenous people in the Caribbean and South America told stories about dark-skinned visitors who came generations before Columbus, wearing gold and speaking foreign tongues. Archaeologists have found African metalwork and symbols buried deep in those lands. But when the evidence surfaced, Western historians shrugged and called it coincidence. Coincidence? Come on now. You don't accidentally
Liars.
send fleets across the Atlantic. You don't accidentally chart the stars with that kind of precision. When Columbus made his so-called historic voyage, he was following paths mapped by people who looked like us. But the world couldn't handle that truth. They needed Africa to look weak, lost, and late to history. They couldn't have a story where a black emperor reached the New World first, so they erased him. They took his name off the maps and replaced it with their own. But lies age badly, and truth always floats back to the surface. The moment you hear Abu Bakr's story, history cracks open, and you realize black excellence didn't begin with survival. It began with exploration. Picture this: hundreds of ships stretching across the horizon, their sails catching the Atlantic wind, their crews made up of the best navigators in the world, black men from the Mali Empire. These weren't pirates or wanderers. They were scientists, sailors, and dreamers guided by the stars, moving west into waters no European had ever dared to cross. While Europe still thought the ocean ended that truth, they needed Africa to look weak, lost, and late to history. They couldn't have a story where a black emperor reached the New World first, so they erased him. They took his name off the maps and
Jealous.
replaced it with their own. But lies age badly, and truth always floats back to the surface. The moment you hear Abu Bakr's story, history cracks open, and you realize black excellence didn't begin with survival. It began with exploration. Picture this: hundreds of ships stretching across the horizon, their sails catching the Atlantic wind, their crews made up of the best navigators in the world, black men from the Mali Empire. These weren't pirates or wanderers. They were scientists, sailors, and dreamers guided by the stars, moving west into waters no European had ever dared to cross. While Europe still thought the ocean ended in dragons and death, Africa was out here testing the limits of the planet. That's not myth, that's recorded history. Chroniclers like Al-Umari documented how Abu Bakr launched one fleet, waited for its return, and when only one ship came back, he didn't panic. He built another bigger, stronger, and said, "I will go myself." That's not fear, that's purpose, that's vision. Now, let's talk about what might have happened next. West African sailors already understood the ocean's currents. They used the same trade winds that later carried Columbus's ships, centuries later. Those winds moved from Africa to South America almost like a highway designed by nature itself. They didn't need compasses. They had stars, rhythm, and centuries of seafaring experience. When Abu Bakr's fleet set sail, they weren't guessing. They were following patterns they had already studied. Every fisherman along the coast knew it. The ocean had a rhythm, and Mali knew how to move with it. Here's where things get deep. Centuries later, when Columbus finally reached the Caribbean, indigenous people there told him something strange. They said black men had been here before. They described them as dark-skinned visitors who came from the east, wearing gold and carrying spears with metal tips that didn't exist in the Americas. Columbus wrote it down himself. Let that sink in. The man they praised for
Absolutely.
discovering America admitted in his own notes that Africans had already been there. Historians downplayed it for centuries, but the evidence keeps popping up like history, refusing to stay buried. In Mexico, archaeologists have found metal alloys identical to those used in West
I
Africa at the
love to
time of Mali.
hear that
In the
Christopher
East, wearing
acknowledged it
gold and
himself.
carrying spears with metal tips that didn't exist in the Americas. Columbus wrote it down himself. Let that sink in. The man they praise for discovering. America admitted in his own notes that Africans had already been there. Historians downplayed it for centuries, but the evidence keeps popping up like history, refusing to stay buried. In Mexico, archaeologists have found metal alloys identical to those used in West Africa at the time of Mali's Golden Age. In South America, ancient carvings show faces with full lips and broad noses, the same features of people from the Niger River region. Even ancient trade routes in Brazil contain fragments of copper and gold mixtures that match Malian craftsmanship. It's like Abu Bakr's ships left fingerprints across an entire hemisphere, and nobody wanted to admit it. Because if they did, the myth of European discovery falls apart. Think about what that means. For centuries, they painted Africa as backward, tribal, uneducated, but here was an empire building ships that could cross oceans while Europe was still arguing about whether the earth was flat. That's why this story hits so hard. It's not just about one man's voyage. It's about reclaiming what was stolen from our narrative. Abu Bakr's journey proves that black people weren't just passengers in history. We were the captains. Every map they drew erased us, but every wave remembers our names. Imagine the scene, the sun setting behind him, the coast of Africa fading into gold, Abu Bakr standing on the deck of his lead ship, staring into the horizon. He knows he may never return, but he also knows that if his ships reach land, it will change the story of humanity forever. That's the spirit they tried to erase, the spirit that said, we don't need to wait for permission to explore the world. And whether or not Abu Bakr ever stepped foot on American soil, the legacy of his courage crossed the ocean. It's in the DNA of every dreamer, every builder, every black soul that refuses to accept the limits the world tries to hand us. This wasn't just a voyage, it was a statement. A declaration that Africa had the power to shape the world before the world ever gave it credit. And that's exactly why, when Europe took control of history, they had to make sure Abu Bakr's name disappeared. Because one truth about a king from Mali could unravel their entire lie. When Europe finally caught wind of Abu Bakr's journey, they didn't celebrate it, they panicked. Because if a black emperor had already crossed the Atlantic, it meant everything they were building their future on was a lie. The myth of discovery,
Sure, it's a
the
lot of
illusion
lies,
of
ain't
white
it?
superiority, the idea that civilization began and ended with them, all of it collapsed the moment Africa took the lead. So they did what colonizers do best. They rewrote the story. They drew new maps, erased old names, and crowned their own explorers as heroes. By the time Columbus set sail almost 200 years later, the world had been rewritten to make him the first. But the irony is, even Columbus himself admitted he wasn't. In his own journals, he talked about meeting dark-skinned people in the Americas who wore gold, spoke in unfamiliar languages, and carried metal weapons identical to African craftsmanship. He knew, and the European monarchs who funded him knew. But truth was bad for business, and they were building empires off deception. The cover-up didn't happen overnight. It was strategic. They started by controlling education, then religion, then art. They painted Africa as the land of savages while stealing African science, navigation, and trade systems to power their own expansion. They renamed our explorers, legends, our kingdoms, tribes, and our genius luck. They turned real emperors into myths so they could turn their own myths into history. Abu Bakr wasn't erased because he failed. He was erased because he succeeded too early. His story was proof that black excellence existed long before they wanted to admit it. Proof that Africa didn't need saving. It was already leading. Think about it. If Europe had admitted that Africa reached the Americas first, everything about the age of exploration falls apart. The gold they stole, the lands they claimed, the people they enslaved, it all becomes theft, not discovery. So they built a lie big enough to hide an ocean. They called it progress, they called it destiny, and they taught it to every generation like gospel. And while they were rewriting the books, Africa's stories faded into silence. The griots who once sang about kings like Abu Bakr were silenced, their records destroyed, their songs dismissed as folklore. But truth never dies, it just waits. Every once in a while a crack shows through the paint. An old map labeled Guinea Coast to the land of the blacks turns up in a European archive. An African coin appears in a South American dig site. A scholar in Timbuktu uncovers another dusty manuscript describing a fleet that sailed into the setting sun. Each clue whispers the same thing. The story we were taught is not the story that happened. And the deeper you dig, the more you realize how intentional the cover-up was. They didn't just want to erase one man, they wanted to erase the idea that Africa could ever be first. But the truth is louder now than ever. We live in a time where the world is finally listening again. The same voices they tried to silence are echoing across documentaries, classrooms, and conversations just like this one. Every word we speak about Abu Bakr II is rebellion against centuries of falsehood. Every fact we share is a strike against the lie that discovery has a color. Because if a black emperor reached the Americas first, then everything we've been told about who shaped the world is upside down. And maybe that's the real reason his name vanished from the pages. They knew that if Africa remembered its explorers, it would also remember its power. Abu Bakr's disappearance wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of ours, the start of a truth that refuses to drown, even when history tries to sink it. The deeper you dig, the harder it gets to deny that Abu Bakr's fingerprints are all over the Americas. You can change the story, but you can't hide the evidence forever. The ocean itself remembers, and so do the lands that welcomed him. Across the Atlantic, traces of Mali's influence linger in ways that defy coincidence. In Brazil, ancient tribes near the northeastern coast have oral histories of black visitors who came from across the sea, bringing gifts, gold, and wisdom. Their stories aren't vague myths. They describe massive canoes with sails, foreign languages, and intricate jewelry that shimmered in the sunlight. In Mexico, early carvings and temple art show faces that look undeniably African, with wide noses and full lips, features that mirror the people of Mali's Niger River. In Peru and Ecuador, archaeologists have found copper and gold alloys that match the exact chemical composition of metals used in West Africa during the 1300s. How could that happen without contact? It's not imagination, it's evidence. Even oceanographers back this up. The same ocean currents that carried Columbus west already flow naturally from West Africa straight into South America. It's like nature itself built a water bridge, waiting for those who had the courage to follow it. Mali's sailors weren't wandering, they were scientists of the sea. They mapped stars, read wind patterns, and memorized the rhythm of waves. Centuries later, when Europeans finally started crossing those waters, they were sailing the same routes Africa had already mastered. But in European retellings, those paths were suddenly discovered. That's not history, that's plagiarism. And the clues don't stop there. When Spanish explorers began mapping South America, they reported seeing black traders among indigenous groups who carried gold in Malian-style bangles. Some even wrote about settlements deep inland, where the people spoke languages unfamiliar to any European translator. It's not hard to imagine what happened. Abu Bakr's ships reached the coast, traded, possibly settled, and left behind a blend of culture and knowledge. Then centuries passed, stories blended, and the world forgot. But the ocean doesn't forget, neither do the stones. The same architectural patterns from the Mali Empire, terraced walls, circular compounds, and sacred geometric layouts, appear in parts of Central and South America, built long before Columbus arrived. Historians call it coincidence. They said the same thing when African carvings turned up in the Caribbean, when similar drums were found in the Amazon, when identical agricultural techniques appeared on both sides of the Atlantic. You can only call it coincidence so many times before it starts sounding like denial. Even the indigenous languages whisper the truth. Some ancient words found in the Americas share eerie similarities to Mande words from Mali. Linguists have noticed parallel sounds and meanings that don't align with Asian migration routes, but match transatlantic exchange. It's not proof of conquest, it's proof of connection. Africa didn't invade, it inspired. Abu Bakr's voyage wasn't about taking, it was about learning. That's what separates him from the so-called explorers who came after. He wasn't trying to claim new worlds. He was trying to understand them. And that's why his story hits so deep for us today. Because we've been taught that curiosity and greatness don't belong to us, that black people were always the explored, never the explorers. But Abu Bakr's story flips that script. It proves that centuries before colonial maps existed, we were already global thinkers, engineers, navigators, and leaders. When they drew their first maps, they erased our faces from the borders we had already crossed. But every artifact, every carving, every story told by the waves, is a reminder that truth doesn't stay buried forever. The ocean has memory, and it's starting to speak again. Being first has never been easy, especially when the world benefits from pretending you never existed. For Abu Bakr's second, leading that voyage wasn't just about curiosity, it was about rewriting what humanity thought was possible. But the tragedy of being first is that you become too powerful for the story they want to tell. Europe couldn't allow Africa to be seen as the origin of innovation. They couldn't admit that while their kings were fighting over crumbs, an African emperor had already reached across oceans. That kind of truth would have destroyed their entire foundation of superiority. So they built walls around it. They called it myth. They called it exaggeration. And eventually, they called it impossible. When Mansa Musa later ruled Mali, he became world famous for his wealth, his pilgrimage, his gold. But notice how even his story gets told without Abu Bakr's name attached. Musa didn't take the throne because his brother died. He took it because Abu Bakr left to explore. That's the part they never teach, because it reminds us that before there were colonizers, there were African explorers. And those explorers weren't lost, they were leading. The Mali Empire's power didn't come from luck. It came from intelligence, trade, and courage. Its rulers weren't sitting in huts. They were building cities, universities, and economies that Europe envied. The idea that such people could cross an ocean before Columbus shattered the illusion that Europe brought progress to Africa. In reality, Africa had progress long before Europe caught up. And that's why Abu Bakr's story was never allowed to survive. His voyage wasn't just a journey, it was a threat. If the world had accepted that a black man discovered the Americas first, the concept of European dominance falls apart. You can't discover a world that someone else already reached. You can't call yourself civilized while erasing the civilization that inspired you. So they silenced it. They erased his name from textbooks and buried his achievements under centuries of lies. Every time they told children that Columbus discovered America, they were reinforcing a system built on theft, not truth. But erasing Abu Bakr didn't erase what he represented. His courage lit a fire that never went out. It burned through generations of black minds, who refused to believe the narrative that we came from nothing. It inspired the dreamers, the inventors, the scholars who knew deep down that their roots ran deeper than any European timeline could explain. And that's the beauty of this story. It's not just about the past. It's about us. It's about what happens when black people stop accepting the version of history that was designed to make them small. Abu Bakr's voyage is proof that our ancestors weren't passengers in the story of civilization. They were driving the ship. Literally. Even now, when you hear about Mali, they focus on Mansa Musa's gold but not Abu Bakr's vision. Because vision can't be controlled. You can steal gold, but you can't steal imagination.
When Santa's sleigh knocked out my satellite dish, I didn't get mad. I got friendly.
That's what scared them most. Abu Bakr proved that the African mind didn't need permission to explore, to create, to connect with the world. That's why the price of being first was silence. But that silence didn't last forever, and the moment you speak his name, the silence breaks again. Every time you say Abu Bakr's a second, you're reminding the world that Africa led the way before it was fashionable to give us credit. So when they tell you Columbus discovered America, just smile, because you know better. You know there was a king who crossed the Atlantic not for conquest but for knowledge. And that story, no matter how hard they try to erase it, will always belong to us. Every empire needs a good story, and Europe built theirs on a lie so big it became legend. They told the world that Columbus discovered America, that Europeans brought civilization to savages, that history began the moment their ships left the shore. And generation after generation, we believed it. We repeated it in classrooms, wrote essays about it, and celebrated it with parades. But when you peel back that lie, what you find underneath is the story of a black king who changed everything, and they couldn't let that truth breathe. So they replaced it with a hero who looked like them. They crowned Columbus the father of discovery, because they needed a symbol of white genius. They needed a man whose face could stand at the front of their myth, even if it meant stealing the legacy of someone else. And that someone else was Abu Bakr's a second. You ever notice how the story never quite makes sense? How can Columbus discover a land already filled with millions of people? How can you find a continent that already had maps, architecture, and trade? The only way that story works is if you erase everyone who came before, and that's exactly what they did. They erased the indigenous nations who built civilizations that rivaled Europe's. They erased the Africans
and
who
then they
sailed
wonder
there
why
first.
they not the
They
chosen.
erased the truth
They're
until all that
liars.
was left was their version, the version that made them gods of history. But the lie had cracks from the start. Columbus's own journals mention seeing black men among the natives. He wrote about people wearing gold and using metal that came from West Africa. Even his crew questioned how the locals got those materials. But instead of investigating, Europe ignored it. The truth didn't fit the script they were writing. That script became their foundation. They turned theft into
Always stealing, always deceptive. Always. Always.
discovery, slavery into civilization, and colonization into destiny. That's the lie they sold to the world. But no lie lasts forever. Every generation, more people start asking questions. If Africa was so uncivilized, how did its sailors build ships that could cross an ocean before Europe even knew how to navigate properly? If Africa was so primitive, why do its architectural designs, astronomical systems, and languages show up in the Americas centuries before European contact? The answers are uncomfortable, because they flip the narrative upside down. They reveal that Europe wasn't leading, it was catching up. When you understand that, everything about the modern world looks different. You realize that our people were written out of greatness, not because we lacked it, but because we had too much of it. Abu Bakr's voyage wasn't lost to time, it was buried under propaganda. His name was scraped off maps, his records suppressed, his evidence labeled myth. They couldn't destroy the truth, so they buried it under their story. And that's how the Columbus legend was born, not from fact, but from fear. Fear that the world would discover who really lit the first spark of global exploration.
I'm Paul Baum, CEO at Planet ROI. We uncover value.
But here's the thing about lies. They require maintenance. They need to be repeated, retold, and reinforced. The truth, it only needs to be rediscovered once. And right now that rediscovery is happening. Every time.
Been done. As the waves of awareness. Welcome to HDTV. You're now rocking with you.
You may have heard of Mansa Musa.
Morning, sweat. Taste test, sweat. Go time, grow time, big time.
Who was. Before we get right into the video, please smash the like button and subscribe to the channel. Most of us were taught that the renowned explorer Christopher Columbus discovered America. Columbus Day, as we know it, commemorates his audacious journey across the vast Atlantic in 1492. The event that is said to mark a significant turning point in history, as it initiated the age of exploration and European colonization in the New World. We were also taught that the first black people to arrive in the Americas were enslaved Africans, who made the journey from West Africa in chains during the times of the transatlantic slave trade. But what if none of these were true? Throughout history, the narrative of Christopher Columbus as the intrepid explorer who discovered the Americas has been ingrained in our collective consciousness. However, a growing body of evidence suggests that this widely accepted historical account is an oversimplification. In fact, there is strong evidence pointing to the fact that Columbus was probably not the first non-Native American to set foot in the Americas. So, if Columbus was not first, then who was? Before we get right into the video, please smash the like button and subscribe to the channel to keep informed of our eye-opening black narrative. In the late 15th century, Europe was gripped by a fervor for exploration, the desire to find new trade routes to the east, and the quest for wealth and power fueled the ambitions of many European nations. At the time, the existing routes to Asia were long and perilous, prompting explorers to seek alternative paths to access the valuable resources of the East. Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer, nurtured a dream of reaching Asia by sailing westward across the Atlantic. Inspired by his own geographical knowledge and theories proposed by various scholars, Columbus believed that the Earth was smaller than commonly believed. He was convinced that by sailing west he could reach the eastern coast of Asia directly, bypassing the established trade routes. His quest to find a direct route to Asia would lead him to the Americas. After a long and arduous voyage on October 12, 1492, Columbus and his crew sighted land, which we now know to be one of the islands in the Bahamas. This momentous event marked the first direct contact between Europe and the Americas. He became known as the man who discovered the New World of the Americas, and Columbus Day is observed on the second Monday in October each year. However, this could not be any farther from the truth. In fact, Columbus was one of the last known explorers to discover America, because Africans had already explored the land hundreds of years before he began his journey. The point is that contrary to what most people believe, the presence of black people in America may not have begun with slavery. However, there exists a belief among some individuals that Africans could not have discovered America before Columbus due to perceived limitations in intelligence and technology. This perspective is rooted in deeply ingrained stereotypes and prejudices that have historically sought to undermine the achievements and capabilities of African civilizations. One reason often cited to support the belief that Africans lacked the capability to explore and navigate the seas is the perceived absence of advanced shipbuilding technology. Detractors argue that African societies did not possess the knowledge or resources to construct seafaring vessels of the magnitude necessary for transatlantic travel. This assumption ignores the rich maritime traditions found in various African regions, including the advanced shipbuilding skills displayed by cultures such as the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, who had significant African influences. These encounters provide valuable insights into the capabilities of African maritime technology. The Portuguese explorer Pacheco Pereira, who traveled along the West African coast in the 15th century, described the large boats as a vessel capable of carrying up to 80 men. Another argument used to support the belief had significant African influences. Many successful modern attempts have shown that without an oar, rudder, or sail, ancient African boats would certainly have been able to cross the vast ocean in a matter of weeks. One notable example is the Portuguese encounters with African boats known as dugout canoes during the 15th century. These encounters provide valuable insights into the capabilities of African maritime technology. The Portuguese explorer Pacheco Pereira, who traveled along the West African coast in the 15th century, described the large boats as a vessel capable of carrying up to 80 men. Another argument used to support the belief revolves around the perceived absence of navigational and astronomical knowledge among African civilizations. Some claim that Africans lacked the ability to accurately chart their courses using celestial navigation techniques or develop sophisticated navigational instruments.
Morning, Pete. Coffee's on and your Uber's on its way.
You know, I've been thinking, maybe I should just go by.
However, this assertion disregards evidence of African society's understanding of celestial bodies, such as the Dogon people's intricate knowledge of the Sirius star system. It also overlooks the sophisticated trade networks that connected African cultures across vast distances, suggesting navigational prowess. In fact, evidence shows that West Africans have sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas at least 180 years before Christopher Columbus. In particular, let me introduce you to Mansa Abubakr II, king of the ancient kingdom of Mali in West Africa. Mansa Abubakr II, also known as Mansa II, was the Mansa or emperor of the Mali Empire from 1307 to 1311 CE. The Mali Empire, during Abubakar's reign, was at the height of its power and wealth. Situated in West Africa, the empire encompassed vast territories, including modern-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, and parts of Mauritania. Its economic prosperity rested on the immense wealth derived from gold and salt trade, making Mali one of the richest empires of its time. Mansa Abubakar's thirst for knowledge and adventure drove him to explore the uncharted waters of the Atlantic Ocean. In 1311, he sent some of his men with enough provisions to last them years on 200 ships to explore the limits of the ocean. He ordered them to not return until they find what is behind the Atlantic Ocean. It is said that only one ship returned, and when asked what happened, the captain responded, "We traveled for a long time, and there appeared in the open sea a river with a powerful current. The other ships went on ahead, but when they reached that place, they did not return and no more was seen of them. As for me, I went about at once and did not enter the river. So Abubakr decided to assemble even more ships. He equipped them with food, water, livestock, gold, and other provisions, left the throne to his brother Mansa Musa, and went to explore himself. They apparently never returned, so the question is, did they ever reach the Americas? Looking at evidence that modern historians, archaeologists, and researchers are now bringing to light, the answer appears to be yes. Today we have evidence and sources to support this theory. Leo Weiner, a Hungarian-American historian and linguist, made a significant contribution to our understanding of pre-Columbian contact between Africans and the Americas. His research shed light on the possibility that Africans had reached the Americas before Christopher Columbus, using evidence derived from Columbus's own accounts. According to Leo Weiner in his book entitled Africa and the Discovery of America, Columbus reported in his journal that the Native Americans confirmed black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats, trading in gold-tipped spears. It appears the Native Americans described the spearheads as guanin, which means gold, in the Mandinka language, a language of the Mali Empire. In his diary and letters, he frequently mentioned the abundance of gold among the natives and their use of gold ornaments. In West Africa, during the time of Columbus, gold was highly valued and held great cultural significance. West African societies, such as the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, were renowned for their gold production and trading networks. The African rulers and elites adorned themselves with intricate gold jewelry as a symbol of power, wealth, and social status. When Columbus encountered the indigenous peoples of the Americas, he was struck by the presence of gold ornaments worn by individuals within these societies. He noted their use of gold nose rings, earrings, pendants, and other types of jewelry. Columbus's descriptions of these ornaments, along with their similarities to West African gold adornments, provided an intriguing clue to the possibility of African influence or contact. While Columbus himself did not explicitly make the connection between the gold jewelry of the indigenous peoples and that of West Africa, historians and researchers like Leo Weiner drew upon this observation to build their case. They argued that the presence of similar gold ornaments suggested a potential trade network or cultural exchange between African and indigenous American populations prior to Columbus's arrival. Columbus also reported seeing mosque-like buildings when he arrived in America. In fact, the people from the Kingdom of Mali were Muslims, so they may have built mosques while there. While Christopher Columbus's accounts provide valuable insights,